That is all for the spotlights for today. So today, backed by popular demand, we have John Hau. John Hau is the lead pastor at Reality Church. He's married to Sarah. They have 3 kids, and in his spare time, he loves to be active, playing soccer and hockey. I personally have the pleasure of hearing John's thoughts in the Jesus Collective Hubs. He's like such a deep thinker and wide reader, so I'm excited to hear from you today. So Pilgrim, would you help me to welcome John Hau?
Thanks, Josh. Well, good morning. I am glad to be back here and glad to be with you this morning. Thanks for coming. I don't know about this when you come to a new community, you have no clue who's going to be there, how many people are going to be there. But I feel this way in my own community too, especially in the summer. I'm like, will anyone be there? And so it's always nice that you guys have chosen to come. And in our community, we talk about rule of life, that coming together, gathering together to pray, to sing, to hear God's word, this is part of our rule of life, the habits that help to shape and form us into people who look like Jesus. So grateful to be sharing this morning with you. A few connections that I have before I talk about the sermon this morning, a few connections that I have in this place. So first, I've worked with Felix and Jessica. I moved here from Alberta with my wife, I think 17 years ago, and we worked at UBC with Felix and Jessica, and so I have a long history with them and really enjoyed learning with them and leading with them together. And then, as Josh mentioned, that he and I and Shell are all part of the Jesus Collective together, and I'm going to talk a bit more about that today. And actually, Shell is preaching at my church today, so that's why I'm here. It's the old pastor shuffle. And then the third thing that we have in common is that our church also went through a transitional time recently. So a little bit of history about the community that I pastor in. So we're a church plant about 15 years ago. And the family that planted the church, the Martins family, they were there for about 10 years. And then they stepped down after 10 years under good circumstances, just done. And we went 2 years without a lead pastor. And so I empathize a lot with what you guys are going through, and have been chatting with Felix and other people here as well, and praying for you guys whenever I come by this area, that God would lead you and guide you through this time. And so before I go into the sermon, I guess it will be kind of connected to the sermon. Oh, actually, there's one more connection. So Ryan Guerrera, actually, as a good friend of mine, the guy who's coming as your transitional pastor, and we grew up just a few hours away from each other in northern Alberta. So you're going to get I'm just getting you ready for the northern Alberta, accent or whatever for Ryan. But he's a great guy and a good friend, and I'm excited that he's going to be here with you. But I just wanted to say before I started, 3 things that I wanted to pass on that I wish I would have known before we went through the transitional time. So we had the pastor there for 10 years, then we had 2 years without a pastor. So the first year was just elder-led, and then we had a transitional pastor for a year, and then I became the pastor after that. But just 3 things that I wanted to pass on from our time that I wish I would have known at the very beginning. And they are from our story, so they may or may not carry over to you guys. But here's the first thing I wish I would have known or really trusted in. I wish, if I was to go back and talk to myself at the very beginning of that time, I would tell myself that God's church will carry on. That God's church will carry on no matter what happens to our community, that God is faithful, and his work in this community, in your lives, in the city will continue. And I knew that in my head, as all of us do, but I didn't really believe it in my heart. And so there's a lot of anxiety, and there's a lot of fear, and there's trepidation in our community, and I wish I would have actually just believed that. So I say that to you this morning, that God's work will continue. God is faithful. His church has lasted for 2,000 years and will continue on into the future. But the second thing is that I would say this, and this is from my experience once again, but the community won't stay the same. The community won't stay the same. This community won't. And it kind of can't. I think that one of the big things that I learned through that process is I was trying to keep the community the same, and a lot of us were. But in fact, it was a time for us to change and to become something new. And so there's a lot of different emotions that go through that time. And I learned a lot from a guy named Pete Scazzaro, who writes a book called Emotionally Healthy Leadership. And he talks about ends and new beginnings. And that might be something you want to think about together as individuals or as a community. It's just like, what does it mean that this season is coming to an end with Shell here in leadership? And what does that mean for each of you? There might be things that you want to celebrate, but there also might be things that you need to mourn. that those seasons and those times are over, and it probably means some people will no longer be here. And I didn't want to believe that when we first started our process. We're like, oh, we'll keep the band together. We could just do it, through prayer and hard work or whatever. But that's not the way that it works. And so things will change here. But the third thing is this, that to figure out what God is calling the next expression of this community to look like, to lean into that and to pray into that together. And I listened to, in preparation for this time, I listened to part of Shell's last Q&A session. And one of the things that he said there that stood out to me is his encouragement. I think the last question was like, what's your encouragement to us as we continue on as a church? He said, remember the work that we've done and keep at it. Remember the work that we've done and keep at it. And so one of the things I want to talk about, or what I want to talk about this morning, is one of those pieces of work that I know Shell's been at here in this community, which is learning how to be Jesus-centered. And it's something that we are also working on in our community. I saw it up on your little video before, that we are a group of people who wants to be Jesus-centered. We're also trying to do that in our community, and that's what the Jesus Collective is all about. I'm on the extended leadership team of the Jesus Collective. So I just say, on my LinkedIn, I just write executive leadership team. Nobody really knows. It sounds a little bit better if you say executive. But it's just like, that's what we're all about in the Jesus Collective, is learning how to be people who are Jesus-centered. And I know that's something Shell has talked about here. And so I want to talk about that a little bit more today, maybe with some different language or some different words to remind you of what it means to be Jesus-centered. And so I want to explore it today by looking at a short passage in Matthew's gospel. It's the naming of the disciples. And it talks about both the idea of being Jesus-centered, or it talks about the idea of Jesus being centered, which is a familiar concept to most of us if you've been here for a while. And this passage is also familiar, but I'm hoping that there's something new for us this morning, or refreshing for us. So we'll take a look at this passage. It's just a few verses, Matthew chapter 10, verse 2-4. So it reads, "These are the names of the 12 apostles." Now, if you are new to the Bible, this number 12 is actually really, really important. So the Hebrew Scriptures, which tells the story of God's people, the Israelite people, and it takes up about 2/3 of the Bible. And so God says, I'm going to bless this small group of people in order to bless the world. That's how God is going to act within the world. And that group of people, the Israelite people, is broken up into 12 different tribes. So when Jesus comes and he says, I'm going to continue God's work in the world, and he chooses 12 people, he's doing something that's blatantly symbolic here. He's trying to say, this is the family that I'm going to carry on God's work through. And so our ears should perk up a little bit. Who gets invited to this family? What do these people look like? And what are the characteristics of this group of people? And so then he names, these are the names of the 12 disciples. It says, first, Simon, who's called Peter, and Andrew, his brother, James, the son of Zebedee, and John, his brother, Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas and Matthew the tax collector, James the son of Alphaeus, and Thaddeus, Simon the zealot, and Judas Iscariot, who also betrayed him. Now, we don't have time to look at everything in this short passage this morning, so here's what I want to do. I want to take some time to look at 4 of the characters that are listed here, and then pull out 4 principles or big ideas about what it means to be Jesus-centered. So that's where we're going this morning if you're a note taker. 4 characters, and then we'll talk about 4 principles of what it means to be Jesus-centered, what Jesus' community looked like, and maybe see if there are some things that we can learn for our community today. So here's the first character I want to look at. It's the guy named Matthew. Now, in this list, we're given a really important modifier about who Matthew is. It says Matthew is a tax collector. So to understand his story, we have to go back into that time in history and understand what's going on. So in that point in history, God's people, the Jewish people, are back in the land that God has given them. But they're not under God's rule solely. They have these Roman people who are reigning and ruling over them, these Roman oppressors that they have. Now, the Romans were really, really smart. They weren't a massive society, but they had a really strong military power. And so they wanted to take over the whole world. So instead of just spreading themselves thin and leaving people everywhere, what they did is they would get local people to govern in their name. So they would have like puppet leaders in the different places that they led. So if you've read the gospel story, Herod, for example, is a Jewish person, but he's like a puppet king. He's actually a puppet of the Romans. And so that's the way that they would lead, is they would get local people to lead in their stead. And tax collectors were the exact same. Even though they would get local people who were Jewish to make the tax happen for the Jewish people. And so the tax burdens that they had from the Roman government were extremely heavy. And this is one of the reasons, if you've read through the Gospels, why Jesus talks about debt and money so often. So it's just an everyday normal reality for the people of that time. And the tax of the Romans was crushing the local people. And so not only was the tax expensive that the Roman people took from the Jews, but it was also offensive. They'd have to pay the tax using coins that had Caesar's face on it. And of course, Caesar thought he was a god or a son of the gods. So even paying this tax was an offensive thing to them. And then just think about it. You're paying a tax to a person or to a group of people in order for them to rule over you. So it's like, give us your money so we can continue to subjugate you and go and subjugate other people. You can just feel that. It's like a punch in the stomach. But on top of this tax being both expensive and offensive, there was a third issue. So imagine the situation like this. A tax collector would set up their booth and you'd have to come. And he would say, okay, so your tax for this year is $10,000 that you owe the Roman government, so please pay that. But also there's this little service charge that I'm going to add on at the end. So it's an extra 20 grand for you and your family. It's like, I don't know if you go out to eat very often, but I've been noticing like the service charges here, which is like, oh, coffee, it's like 18%. It just starts there. You don't have a choice to go any lower than that. And that's how it was. Is they could just add any amount that they wanted onto their fee as a fee, and they were backed by the Roman military. So if you said no, they're like, well, we'll get the Roman military after you. And so people hated tax collectors. They're like Jewish people, they're brothers and sisters who have completely sold out. And they've put their own well-being and their own financial gain ahead of their brothers and sisters and ahead of God's people and God's work in the world. They're working against what was thought of to be what God was doing at the time. And so Matthew would be absolutely despised in his culture and in his time. And this is how he's named in the Gospel of Matthew, Matthew the tax collector. Now let's look at a second character in the story of Jesus, or in Jesus' crew here. That's Simon the Zealot. So if Matthew had assimilated into the Roman government and become part of the system of oppression, the Zealots went the complete opposite direction. So they were taking on political activism in order to get rid of their Roman oppressors. So they were bent on revolution. And they were waiting for and searching for this character who is called the Messiah, who would come and he would violently overthrow the Roman people. And they had a radical group within them. So within the Zealots, they had this radical group called the Sicarii. And so they would have these tiny little daggers, and they would keep them concealed in their cloaks. And they would go into crowded spaces, and they would find people who are Romans or Roman sympathizers, and they would just walk up to them and stab them. And then as they fell to the ground, they would just put the knife back in their cloak and just slowly walk away. So the next time you're at a crowded SkyTrain station, just think of that image, of people doing that. That's what, it would just be completely frightening, but that was their way of going against the Roman oppressors. And if you've ever played Assassin's Creed, some of you look a little, maybe that you haven't played Assassin's Creed, but some of you may have. That character is supposedly based on that. Same kind of an idea. A person with a cloak, a person with a dagger, just coming and stealthily killing people. That's how Simon is identified, is this kind of a person who's going against the Roman government. So if Matthew is a complete sellout, Simon is like Robin Hood. Matthew has completely assimilated into the culture. He's become a puppet of the empire. And Simon is completely against the culture and trying to murder those who are in power. Two different people, two fundamentally different ways of looking at the world, and men who would, under normal circumstances, never, ever connect with each other and would hate each other. And Jesus comes and he says, hey, I'm starting a new family. Through I'm going to bless the world. And I want you, and I want you. And so here's the first point that I want to make this morning. A Jesus-centered community, if we take a look at this passage, a Jesus-centered community is made up of people who are different. A church, a community that follows Jesus should be made up of people who are different and sometimes diametrically opposed to one another. in very fundamental ways in the rest of the world that we would never connect with each other. Paul, in his letters, he often picks up on this theme. Very famous passage in Galatians. He says that Jesus can bring together Jew and Gentile, slave and free, male and female. All these things out in the rest of the world that would keep us completely apart from one another, there's something in Jesus that can draw us together. Now, here's the danger in saying something like that. All of us that attend church, and all of us that are part of churches, believe that we're part of those kind of communities, welcoming communities. All we have to do is go look on our websites, and you'll see that we all say the same kind of thing, like everyone is welcome here, we're united in Jesus, or we're a diverse community of Jesus followers, worshiping God in the city. I think that's what it says on our website. So I'm not dunking on anyone specific here. We all say this kind of thing, and we all think it's true about ourselves, that we welcome anybody, but it's not actually true in practice. And I would say this about our community. It's not true in practice. And one of the reasons I can say that, even though I don't know you all very well, I think I can say it with a certain level of certitude, is because of something that recently happened called COVID. Do you guys have COVID here? I don't know. We're a few blocks away, so I wasn't 100% sure. But here's what COVID was like in the communities that I was a part of. It showed that we were way less unified than we thought we were, specifically in the church. And it ripped families apart, it ripped relationships apart, and it ripped churches apart. And I look at COVID maybe something like this. It was almost like a car wash. I don't know if you've ever had your car very dirty. You guys look like super clean people, so this probably never happened to you. But if your car is super dirty, but you think underneath, underneath it's fine. It's just, I just have to go get it washed. And then you go get it washed and you're just like, oh no, there's dents and missing paint and rust. That's a more Northern Alberta problem, is rust. Maybe you guys don't deal with that as much down here. But you have all these different problems on your vehicle. That's what COVID was, I think COVID was like to me, what my observations were. Before COVID, there was just a sheen of stuff over the church that masked over our differences. And so we were like, oh, brother, good to see you, great to see you. And COVID happened, and it's like it washed the car clean, and all that we saw was our differences. And they absolutely ripped us apart. And so we showed, actually I would say this, we showed that we were just like the rest of the culture. In some cases, maybe even more polarized than the rest of the culture. COVID showed that to us. So as Jesus followers and as churches, there has to be another step. We can't just say the church is a diverse group of people. That's not going to work. There has to be something else that ties us together that's stronger than our Facebook tribes or our political parties or our families of origin or our generational differences. Something else has to happen. So what could we learn from this group of disciples that can help us to become the community that Jesus died to create? Then here's principle number 2. A Jesus-centered community must tell and listen to each other's stories. A Jesus-centered community must tell and listen to each other's stories. We've taken a bit of time this morning just to understand the context of Matthew's story and Simon's story. So we understand now what it meant that one is called a tax collector and the other is called a zealot. But if we wanted to form a community with these people, if we actually wanted to be in a community with them, we would have to take time to have them narrate their stories and for us to listen to their stories. For us to say to Matthew, can you tell me a little bit more about why you became a tax collector? How could you become a tax collector? Or to Simon, tell me the path about becoming a zealot. And you're thinking in the back of your mind, I would never become a zealot. But you have to listen to him tell his story. And it's not about blessing his story and saying, whatever your story is, that's totally great, and we just 100% accept you. That's not the point of it. The point is to narrate, and the point is to listen. Because we are story-driven people. We are story-driven animals. Listen to an example here from Alistair McIntyre in his great book, After Virtue. This is a long quote, but it's really helpful. He says this: imagine you're standing at a bus stop when a young man you do not know comes up to you and says, the name of the common wild duck is Histrionicus, Histrionicus, Histrionicus. So even though you understand the sentence, you understand the words that the person said, his actions make no sense. What does it mean? The only way to make sense of it is to try to learn the story into which the event fits. Perhaps the young man is mentally ill. That would explain it. Or what if yesterday someone of your gender, age, and general appearance had approached the young man in the library and asked him the Latin word for the wild duck, and today he has just mistaken you for that person? That would explain it too. Or perhaps the young man is a foreign spy, waiting at a prearranged rendezvous and uttering the ill-chosen code sentence which will identify him to his contact. The first story is sad, the second story is comic, and the third is dramatic. But the point is, without a handle on the story, there is no way to understand the meaning of what happened and no way to understand how to answer the man. And he ends this way. Man is essentially a storytelling animal. Man is essentially a storytelling animal. At our core, that is what we are and what we do, is we're telling stories about ourselves. We're telling stories about our world. And so we have to, if we're going to form community with each other, not just put each other into tribes, but hear each other's stories. He says, man is essentially a storytelling animal, but a teller of stories that aspire to truth. Man is essentially a storytelling animal, but a teller of stories that aspire to truth. So our stories must be told. Our stories must be given space to be heard, but they don't sit at the center of this community. In a church, our stories cannot sit at the center, not because our stories are not important, but because that place is reserved for Jesus. His story sits at the center of the community. He is the weighty one. That's what the word glorious means. He is the heavy one in our community, the one that ties us all together. He is the truth that our stories are to aspire to. And that's principle 3. A Jesus-centered community is one that has Jesus at the center. A Jesus-centered community is one that has Jesus at the center. I stayed up all night writing that sentence last week. But the main focus in here can't be the stories that we have that are different than one another. It's about the shared center we hold. And that's just a value. It's a difference. I'd say like this. Before COVID, our stories, or COVID showed that our stories actually were more weighty than the Jesus that we hold together. We might have espoused. We might have said, oh, I love Jesus. You love Jesus. Yes, indeed. Whatever, however that chant goes. But it's like, actually, what it showed is that Jesus was less weighty. And what we are to do, if we're going to form a community of people who are different, who look like Jesus' family, what we have to do is reverse that. We still have differences, but we have to hold together around the story of Jesus. Matthew and Simon would, in normal circumstances, be arch enemies. They would go to different churches, they would have different algorithms running their social media, and they would vote for different political parties. But when they say yes to Jesus, to be included in the 12, he becomes the new center of their community. He becomes the link between these two individuals. He becomes the gravitational pull that draws them together into community. And so when they sit down at a table with each other, they're not just sitting down with two individuals. Jesus is there at the table with them. He is the one who draws them together. And so they might be diametrically opposed to each other in the rest of the world, but they can stay seated and they can eat together if Jesus is at the table with them, saying, take this bread. I bless it, I break it, and I give it to you, both of you. Eat and be part of my family. And they have to do that. They have to move their primary identity away from being tax collectors and zealots to have Jesus at the center. So this is not, being Jesus-centered is not about having weak theology or going soft on sin or having everybody simply just tell their truth and blessing that. It's about taking the oldest Christian creed that we have and making it the most true thing about our communities, that Jesus is Lord. That out there, we have all sorts of things that divide us, but when we come in here, the King is present, and he's the one who unites us together. And in our community, one of the ways that we're trying to do that is trying to reimagine what we do when we come together at this table. For most of the time that I've been a Christian, the only vision that I've had of what happens when we come to the table, which we're going to do later together, is that we remember what Jesus has done. It's a very individual pursuit. I have sinned, I remember the sin that I have, and I remember that Jesus has died and forgiven my sin. And that's true. I'm not saying that isn't. But one of the other ways that we can remember, one of the things that we're trying to remember in our community is that when I come to the table, I also come with you. And I come with you, and I come with you, and I come with you. We come together with all of our different stories, which need to be heard. But we commit together to making this story the heaviest one in this space and in our lives. The broken body of our King, the blood shed for the new covenant. This is the heaviest story, and we say this is our story. And so, yes, we may have lots of differences, but when we come here to this table, we agree to make this the most important thing. So the stories of Matthew the tax collector and Simon the zealot, they teach us that difference is actually a feature and not a bug of God's family. But in order for the difference to actually be a feature, we must learn to tell our stories. And we have to have all of those stories sit underneath the story of Jesus, or the old word is submit. If you don't like that word, just plug your ears for a second. We have to have all of our stories submit to the story of Jesus. So let's look at two more people and one more principle to bring this home. Let's start by looking at another character in this list. His name is Judas. Now it's good, we know one thing about Judas, right? But it's good to remember that Jesus in this list is saying, these are the 12 people that I'm going to work through. So Judas, out of all the people at that time, he's drawn into the circle of Jesus. He's one of the 12. And he's also, it doesn't say it in this passage, but Judas is the treasurer. Now, I don't know how you guys run your board here. I'll ask Felix after. But I don't know if you just let people wander in and be the treasurer. If so, maybe I'd be applying for a job for the treasurer. But in most communities, you only allow someone who has high character to be the treasurer, someone that you can really, really trust. And so Judas is pulled into the inner circle of Jesus. It's important for us to remember that. So it's I visualize it like this. If Jesus is here and you're trying to make him the weighty center, I would think Judas is super close. He's the treasurer of the community. Now let's contrast him with another character, Thomas. Again, we only know one thing about Thomas, right? What's that? Doubting, right? And if Thomas was here, I bet you he would say this. Look, you bake one cake, you're not a baker. You paint one painting, you're not a painter. But I doubt one time. And all anybody knows about me for 2,000 years is doubting Thomas, right? But here's the point. If we were to put him on that same idea or that same the visual, where would he be? Would he be as close as Judas? I don't think so. I don't know that I want that guy managing the money. I don't know that he's the closest to Jesus. We know him for one thing, which is that he's a doubter. So he's probably farther away. Yeah, he's in the 12, but maybe just barely in, right? But here's where the story gets kind of weird. Because the one thing mentioned in this passage about Judas is that Judas Iscariot is the one who betrayed Jesus. It's the one story we know about him. And so although Judas seems super close to Jesus, and he said yes to Jesus at one point in time, that's how Jesus invites his followers. He says, come and follow me. So Judas has moved towards Jesus. And he seems very, very close, a trusted member of Jesus' community. At some point in time, his story has taken a different direction. He stopped saying yes to Jesus as his rabbi, to Jesus as his teacher, to Jesus as the Lord, and he started saying yes to something else. Something else has become the gravitational pull in his life. And we know, if you know a bit about the story of Judas, I would say it this way, he's been baptized into a different story, a story of prophet. And you could see that because he commodifies Jesus. He says, this is how much your life is worth, 30 pieces of silver to me. That's what happens when we worship at the temple of prophet, is we learn to commodify other people. And so we might visualize it this way. Even though Judas looks very close to Jesus, to our eyes, he has stopped moving towards Jesus. The direction of his life is actually headed away. And I can't think of a better way to describe what's happened, very sadly, with several prominent Christian leaders in our world. I don't have to name names. You all probably know different stories of people. They look very close. They've got high, abilities. Maybe they're very funny, or they're very smart, or they're great preachers, or whatever it is, or they have huge platforms. But the actual direction of their lives has gone away. And they've been baptized into a different story, and they've taken on a different spirit about their lives. The classic things that from the very beginning of God's story has haunted us. Money, sex, power. And this can happen to us too. This happens in a much less dramatic way because we don't have the same kind of platform. We can say the same thing about our lives as Christians. Oh, I've been in the church for a long time. I was baptized when I was 5. I've served in various capacities here. I'm in leadership. But in reality, we've stopped saying yes to what God is calling us to. We look very close, but the direction of our lives is no longer headed towards Jesus, but away. We've stopped listening for, as the Bible says, that still small voice, calling us to bear fruit. We stopped listening, or we stopped that pursuit of Jesus, that desire to come close and to come near. As it says in Revelation, our love has gone cold. And this is the final key idea I want to share with you about what it means to be a Jesus-centered community. A Jesus-centered community is more focused on direction than it is on distance. A Jesus-centered community is more focused on direction than it is on distance. In other words, it's not focused on many of the things that we tend to focus on church, or what I call churchianity. And they're all generally good things, like statement of faith. Do you agree with the statement of faith? Or are you baptized? Do you come to church? If you come to church, how often? Where do you serve? How much do you give? And I think as a preacher who's coming from the outside, I'm legally obligated to say give. Giving is a good thing. All these things are good, actually. Being baptized is really good and important. But the focus in a Jesus-centered community is that Jesus is at the center, and it's asking a different type of question. Which direction are you going in your life right now? Are you headed towards Jesus? Or are you headed away? And I would suggest this: the next time that you read through the Gospels, take this lens and apply it to what's happening in the Gospel. Watch what Jesus does. And here's the thing I found personally. The people who you think would be super close, the people with money, with power, with prestige, the Pharisees, the power brokers, those who are in leadership in the military, Jesus often doesn't have a lot of time for them. In fact, he's usually pretty harsh on them. The kinds of people that Jesus has loads and loads of time for are people that we probably put at the margins of our church, like maybe they're barely in or they're outside, but they're moving towards. That's what I see. Jesus seems to have an amazing radar for these people and loads of time for these kinds of people. And let me give you just one example and finish here by looking at Thomas's story. Again, we know Thomas for one thing, which is doubting. In most churches, why is doubt such a bad thing? Well, that could be a whole sermon in itself, but Josh told me I can't include that one this morning. So here, let me just give you 2 reasons why I think so. The first reason doubt is so bad in our churches is because, or we think it's so bad, is because we're actually, when people doubt, they're questioning the true things that hold us together, which is not Jesus. If we doubt, we're questioning, for example, our statement of faith, or how we practice our faith in the world, or the things that we've inherited. The second reason is because we assume that when people are doubting, it means they're moving away from Jesus, that their arrow is moving away. And don't get me wrong, that can happen. Like, I live in the city. I totally understand that doubt can lead people away from Jesus. But here's the thing I've found here's the way that being Jesus-centered has helped me change my paradigm on that. When I dig into the personal existential crises and the doubts that I have, which have been legion over my life. I was saying this to my wife earlier. I was preaching this sermon in another place, and I said every 2 to 3 years. And then I said to my wife, it means I'm probably due for another existential crisis, like right about now. And she's just like, oh boy. So I've had these come up in my life over and over again. But here's what I've realized. These crises of faith or these doubts actually aren't really about Jesus at all. They actually come from following him most of the time in my life. And he's revealing to me that I've made something else the center of my life, not Jesus. So for me, one of the places that happens is with rationality, that I want to understand everything rationally. And in following Jesus, I'm just pushed to my limits. I'm pushed to a place of existential doubt because I'm worshiping a God who's 3 in 1, a person who is both God and human, a God who has been raised from the dead and is now reigning and ruling. And it pushes me to my rational limits. But it's not, the limit that I have is not Jesus himself. It's the limit of my rationality. Or for example, control is another thing that I put in the middle for myself. One of the reasons that I study and learn about God is to know him, but a sidebar of that is actually that I want to be able to control him. I want no surprises. I want to be able to know what's coming next. I want to maybe know more than other people. It's ways of controlling God. And the God who is God, the God who is in the Bible, is uncontrollable. And so when I come to these moments of existential crisis, it's actually me. It's me reaching my limits, not Jesus. Or, for example, comfort. I put comfort into the middle of my life, and so I have suffering going on or something else going on, and I'm having doubt. But it has nothing to do with Jesus. It has to do with my own limits and the story that I've placed Jesus within. And so my crises, I found, actually aren't crises about the real Jesus. They're crises about the way that I've made other things the center in my life. And Jesus, in pushing me through those moments of doubt or walking with me through them, is lovingly calling me away from those things to a more vibrant faith where he can sit at the center, where he can be the center of my life and hopefully the center of our community. And so I have loads of time for people like Thomas. And I pastor a community basically filled with Thomases. And so one of the things one of the places that's been really helpful to me is a passage from a guy named Malcolm Guite. He's a poet who teaches at Regent, and here's how he describes Thomas. He says this: "Courageous master of the awkward question, you spoke the words that others dared not say, and cut through their evasion and abstraction, O doubting Thomas, the father of my faith." And so maybe in a Jesus-centered way of looking at the church, our doubts and our questions don't have to become something that we immediately fear, but they can actually become something that help us walk and partner with the true living God and with each other. So that's a bit more about what it means to be Jesus-centered, and also why I'm part of the Jesus Collective and why I pastor. Because I can't think of a better thing to do with my life, a better thing to put my hands to, than to try to create a community, a diverse community, where we share our stories with each other, but we come together around the person of Jesus, and we learn to partner with him as we say yes to what the Spirit is guiding us to in our lives. Where might be the places in your life that God is calling you closer as we do come to the table together? Let's pray to close. Father, as we even read through this list, I'm reminded that these are real people that you called into your family and into your community. Definitely probably wouldn't be people that we would call, they're definitely not all first rounders, but you called them. And I pray this morning as we come together around your table, as we continue to worship, that you would call us. We would hear your voice saying, "Follow me." That we would take the stories that we have, that we would learn to tell them and trust each other with them, that we would be good listeners, but that ultimately we would come together around your story. As we come together around the table, that this would become the weighty center of this community, in order for your light and your goodness and your glory to be shone not only into our lives, but into the watching world that needs it so deeply. So we give you this time, and we pray these things together in the name of Christ. Amen.